husband's family gave me the cold shoulder when I announced my pregnancy, but later I found out why, and I got my revenge on all of them. I'm a 28-year-old woman, and my husband Ron, 34, is going through a huge crisis. I need to know if what I'm about to do is the right thing. To set the stage, I met Ron 4 years ago, and I still remember the day like it was yesterday. I used to go to the same cafe all the time, and I guess he must have noticed me because one morning he walked over and asked for my number. Ron is really handsome and seemed to work in finance, just like me, so I didn't hesitate to give him my number. He called, we talked, and soon went on a date. Ron was completely upfront from the beginning about his family's wealth. He told me that his dad had worked extremely hard to become one of the best real estate agents in order to give his family a lavish lifestyle. He asked about my family, and I explained that I came from a low-income background but had worked hard to become an accountant. I had a good income and was self-sufficient, which was a dream come true given where I came from. At first, everything seemed perfect between Ron and me. He took me to fancy dinners, bought me expensive gifts, and wouldn't stop talking about his family's riches. He lived in a spacious mansion, drove luxury cars, and wore designer clothes without a second thought. Coming from humble beginnings myself, I was captivated by his lifestyle, and admittedly a little intimidated. I even told him that he was free to find someone else of his status, but despite our different backgrounds, Ron and I connected on a deeper level. I had a stable job that I was proud of, and he admired my determination and work ethic. When I met Ron's family for the first time, I couldn't help but notice the air of arrogance about them. Their mansion looked like something out of a magazine, filled with expensive art and luxurious decor. But what shocked me the most was how cold and distant they were toward me. From our very first meeting, his mother refused to shake my hand and blatantly ignored me. It was as if she immediately assumed I was only with Ron for his money, and she made that very clear with her behavior and pointed questions about my background. His parents wanted to know everything about my upbringing, education, and career, as if they were trying to determine if I was worthy of being with Ron. His older sister kept questioning whether Ron had really met me at that cafe or if it was some elaborate scheme to find me. No matter how many times Ron and I explained that he had invited me and that I didn't know him beforehand, she wouldn't believe it, telling me that everyone already knew who they were. Honestly, I'd never heard of them or seen them before, since I didn't grow up in such a wealthy neighborhood. Despite the insults and even a few light blows, I kept quiet. At the end of the meeting, his dad admitted that I seemed like a hardworking woman, but he had always dreamed of seeing his son marry someone of their status. That really offended me, because I had never asked Ron to fund my lifestyle. It wasn't my fault where I came from. In the end, all the challenges I faced made me the independent person I am today, and I wasn't about to be ashamed of that. After that meeting, I told Ron I was done meeting his parents and that he should see his family on his own from then on. I didn't want to go through that constant scrutiny. He tried to protest, but I stood firm and told him how humiliating it had been. I even pointed out that my own parents had never treated me that way, so his parents had no right to be so cold and unwelcoming. In the end, he agreed, and from then on he always met with his family on his own. Despite what his family thought, our relationship continued to flourish, and soon we were talking about moving in together. I should add that this was entirely Ron's idea. You see, my lease was up and I was looking for a bigger place to move in with my dog. When Ron suggested that we move in together, and after about 10 months of dating, I was a bit hesitant. However, he reasoned with me, painting a picture of spending the rest of his life with me and saying that moving in together was the next logical step in our relationship. I took a few days to think it over, and in the end, I agreed. His house, bought by his father, was truly grand, but it always felt a bit cold, you know? Like walking into a high-end interior design showroom where everything is carefully curated but lacks the warmth of a lived-in home. I set about turning that cold, lifeless house into a home. We had agreed to split expenses, which I didn't mind because I liked paying my own way, and besides, I wasn't paying any rent. I think that's when I started noticing more about his life. Now that we were living together, the charms and luxurious lifestyle he'd once dazzled me with began to show cracks. One of the first things I noticed was the emptiness of his daily routine. Although he worked in finance, he rarely went to the office, only 1 day a week. He told me that his boss was a friend of his dad's, so he didn't have to be there every day, which I guess made sense. However, instead of working a 9 to 5, he would get bored and irritable and go shopping. I was at the office when he'd send me multiple photos of himself wearing different luxury shoe brands, asking which pair I liked best. This happened at least 3 times a week, but since it was his money, I didn't say anything. Then, every time he bought a new pair, he'd take pictures and post them online, constantly checking his phone to see if his friends or followers liked his story. Ron had turned a bit into an influencer, always posting luxury items, so I guess that's why he was always on his phone, seeking validation and approval. His social media friends would sometimes invite him to parties, but he never took me along, giving excuses like he wasn't allowed to bring a +1 and that he just wanted to make new friends on his own. I kept quiet, though it bothered me a bit. After that, he bought a luxury sports car. I still don't know how someone can spend that much money on just a 4-wheeled vehicle. Meanwhile, I noticed he had no interest in paying his bills. Even though we had agreed to split expenses, he always ended up telling me to cover everything, including his phone and cable bills, which he barely used. Whenever I brought it up, he'd say that we were partners and that since he let me stay rent-free, I should help out more. Looking back, I don't think it was really about the bills. It was the nagging feeling that something about him was just off. If he was rich enough to buy shoes, clothes, and luxury cars, why did he need help paying his bills? I was grateful to be living in his house rent-free, but I wouldn't mind paying rent and living on my own if it meant I'd only be paying my own bills, unlike him. I had a fixed budget and wanted to save as much as possible for someday starting a family. I felt that he needed to do the same. If that wasn't our goal, then I didn't want to be with him. I decided to have a serious conversation where I laid everything out plainly and gave him the option to break up with me if we weren't on the same page. However, he assured me that he really wanted to start a family with me and that I was a reliable woman. He promised that he would stop overspending. I thought everything would be fine after that. Then, one day while I was cleaning his garage on a weekend, while he was out playing golf, I discovered that Ron had been putting on a facade for everyone, including me. It turned out that most of what he bragged about was financed through debt and loans. His luxury car and designer wardrobe were bought on credit. He had recent credit bills he was avoiding paying, and I was stunned when I found those bills hidden in a shoebox. This meant he'd been keeping all this from me. I was furious. I waited until he returned from golf with his friends. When he got back, he saw me sitting with all his bills spread out on the table, and he went into a frenzy. He started yelling at me about why I was looking through his bills, and I told him I knew everything and that he couldn't hide from me anymore. Ron tried to backtrack, saying they were just a few bills and that he was working on paying them, but I asked him why he hadn't paid them yet when he was supposedly earning money every month. That's when Ron confessed that he hadn't been working for the past 4 months. I was shocked. He had been going to the office once a week as usual for the last 4 months, and on the other days, we'd message each other while he supposedly worked from home. I asked him how that had happened and why he never told me. Ron poured his heart out about how his boss, who he called an idiot, went back on his word and pressured him to go to the office every day since the company was taking on more clients and he needed more face-to-face meetings. However, Ron felt disrespected, and he and his boss had a fallout that ended with him being fired. Ron continued saying it wasn't a huge deal and that he'd find another job in no time once he started looking. My eyes widened in shock when I asked him what the heck he'd been doing for the last 4 months if he hadn't even started job hunting. He replied that he was taking a mental health break and that I shouldn't blame him for anything. I told him that even though he'd lost his job, it made no sense because he couldn't pay his bills, especially since he supposedly came from a wealthy family. Ron said he'd asked his parents for help, but they refused. He vented about how his parents clearly favored his older sister and how unfair that was. I felt like our entire relationship had been a lie. The image he'd painted of himself was beginning to crumble. Clearly, he wasn't rich, which meant he was relying on me to cover his bills, all while his unemployed ass kept buying luxury items and posting about them on social media. I told him firmly that I loved him, but this wasn't what I signed up for. I said that I knew exactly how it felt to be broke. I had worked my ass off to get out of that situation, and I wasn't about to let anyone drag me back there. I warned him that if he didn't change immediately and show me through actions, I'd pack my things and leave his house that very afternoon. I guess seeing me so angry finally got through to Ron. Immediately, he apologized and sat down to discuss ways to tackle his debt. I told him he needed to sell his car, pay off all his credit card bills, and stop splurging on luxury items for a while. Ron tried to argue, saying people would judge him and that his friends would laugh at him, but I told him I didn't give a damn because his debts were piling up and had to be addressed first. He even asked if I could help pay part of the loan, but I refused and made it clear that this was his responsibility, while I would cover our monthly bills and daily expenses. I told him that until he took proactive steps to reduce his debt, I wouldn't feel comfortable discussing a future with him. Reluctantly, he agreed. In the following months, Ron took proactive steps to tackle his debt. We put his car up for sale, and since it was a sports car, we were lucky enough to get enough from the sale to pay off his loan and have some money left over. Then, he cut back on unnecessary expenses and focused on paying off his credit card bills. As you can imagine, it was a tough time for him, as he wasn't used to cutting back on anything. There were moments of frustration and doubt, but I kept encouraging him to work hard to regain control of his finances. Eventually, Ron managed to pay off a significant chunk of his debt. I felt proud that he was trying. We even talked about him getting a steady job, but then Ron told me about his plan to start his own business. He said he had an entrepreneurial spirit and wanted to explore it. I was vehemently against it since I'm much more risk-averse than Ron. I knew he could be very impulsive at times, and I wasn't sure if he had the determination to focus on building his business. However, since he had worked hard to pay off his debt, I admit I didn't fight too hard on that front. Then Ron proposed to me, which caught me completely off guard. He told me that he'd heard all my demands and had paid off his debts, so now we could focus on starting a family together. I said yes, because at the end of the day, I truly loved him, and all I wanted was for him to keep working hard, just like me, so we could build a life together. He mentioned that his parents hadn't known he was going to propose, so he was nervous about telling them. When he called to inform them, they said that although they were happy for him and would support him, they really hadn't expected him to end up with someone like me. On the other hand, my own parents were happy for me. We had a small wedding because I didn't want to spend too much and ruin our credit situation, especially since Ron had just gotten out of debt. My parents kindly stepped in to help cover the wedding costs, and I also used some of my savings. Ron's contribution, on the other hand, was minimal despite his family's supposed wealth. Throughout all of this, Ron stayed silent, never correcting any assumptions or admitting the truth, and I couldn't help but feel a twinge of disappointment. It was disheartening to see him enjoy false praise, especially knowing that he'd been unemployed for months and hadn't contributed nearly as much financially as one would expect. His parents shamelessly never corrected anyone either, maybe because they felt guilty. Later on, they decided to pay for our honeymoon. That was unexpected, but we accepted it because otherwise, we might not have even gone on a honeymoon after the wedding. After our wedding and honeymoon, Ron worked on launching his own social media agency, just as he had planned, where they'd work with brands and hire influencers. Sure, it's a lucrative business, but there are hundreds of agencies like this, and it's hard to stand out. He would come home complaining about how he couldn't land an influencer for an event or that he'd lost an influencer who wasn't willing to negotiate. Moreover, brands rarely worked with new agencies, so he really struggled to find brands that trusted him enough to sign on. As a result, the business never generated much income, and sometimes he begged me to go back to a regular 9-to-5 job, even though it wasn't as exciting. Ron would get angry and tell me he needed time, that he'd eventually make it work. Meanwhile, I was getting more and more frustrated being the sole breadwinner, working every second I was awake. I'd come home only to keep working, the dishes piled up, the laundry accumulated, and the dog needed walking. On top of that, he expected me to cook for him while listing all the bills that needed to be paid. Whenever I mentioned my job, he'd say how happy he was that he'd left his job because he couldn't handle as much stress as I did. That really pissed me off because I was the one paying for everything with my stressful job while he was out partying at various events every day. Slowly, I began to resent him more and more. We did nothing together but watch TV, and I started feeling suffocated. On weekends, I slept in because I was constantly exhausted after working all week. Whenever I asked him to help with housework, he told me that starting a business required 100% of his energy and that, as his partner, I should be more understanding. Last month, on top of all this stress, I discovered I was pregnant. I had always imagined being pregnant and having a baby, but for some reason, I felt this wasn't the way I wanted to start a family. I mean, when you bring a child into this world, you want them to have a stable home and two supportive parents. In our case, I was the only one providing, and he wasn't contributing anything to the household. If I had a child, I'd have even more work on top of what I was already doing. I decided to talk to him about my thoughts. Unlike me, Ron was ecstatic. He hugged me with joy. He told me how wonderful the news was and that he couldn't wait to be a father. When I mentioned how exhausted I felt at home and how having a baby would only add to my workload, he agreed and said he'd start taking on more responsibilities. I was surprised by his enthusiasm and glad that he was going to act. In the past few weeks, Ron has started stepping up. I still do about 80% of the housework, cooking, cleaning, laundry, but now he washes the dishes, takes out the trash, and walks the dog. I thought that over time, things might gradually improve. Then, just this past weekend, he told me he was going to visit his family. I said I'd join him, since we wanted to announce the pregnancy together. I never expected his parents to be excited about our baby, but when I announced it, their faces literally fell. His mother and his sister mocked me and gave me the dirtiest looks, while his father looked down as if he'd committed a huge mistake. His mother looked me straight in the eyes and said that it was simply ridiculous to bring a child into our marriage given all the problems we were facing. I asked her what she meant, but she ignored me and excused herself from the table. Ron and I decided to leave because the atmosphere had clearly been ruined, and I had no idea why. On the way back, I asked him what his mother had been talking about, but he just shook his head, saying he had no idea, and that it would be better if he continued seeing his family on his own from now on. I was really angry and disappointed that I hadn't done anything to deserve that treatment, and with the baby on the way, I thought that maybe for once we could put the past behind us for the sake of the child. Yesterday, while I was at work, I got a call from my sister-in-law. She'd never called me before unless it was something really important, so I answered immediately, thinking maybe something had happened to my husband or his parents. During our conversation, she told me that she had spoken with Ron, who felt that all of them were treating me with a complete lack of respect, but she wanted to finally explain why everyone felt that way. She continued by saying she knew how hard we were struggling because of all his debts and that his family didn't appreciate all the work Ron was doing for me when I wasn't contributing financially. I took a moment to process everything and then asked her to explain exactly what she meant, because I was confused by her insinuations. My sister-in-law then went on to say that Ron had told them I was massively in debt and that he was the one who had to pay for everything by selling his car and even sacrificing his ability to buy luxury brands. My head was spinning as she explained how he couldn't let his siblings suffer any longer and that I shouldn't trap him with a baby. I can't even begin to express how angry I was at that moment. This spoiled kid had gone and lied to his family, saying I was in debt just to save his own skin. Clearly, he didn't want people to think he was broke, so he cooked up this ridiculous story to pin it on me. There I was, working my ass off day and night at a job I hated just to pay our bills, while he was out inventing stories. I was so angry that I didn't even want to explain anything to his sister. Instead, I simply told her she was right and that I shouldn't trap him with a baby because he wasn't even worthy of being a father in the first place. Then I hung up and told my boss I wasn't feeling well so I could go home. I knew my husband was out there, meeting with an influencer, so I quickly gathered my things and left with my dog. I didn't even leave a note, I just packed everything into my car and went. Since yesterday, I've been living at my parents' house while Ron has been calling me nonstop. He must have talked to his sister because he sent me messages explaining how he could fix everything and that he just needed me to come back home. His parents still have no idea what's going on, but they know it's a serious issue, so they haven't asked too many questions. On one hand, I'm pregnant and I want my child to have a father, but on the other hand, I refuse to be with someone who's been lying about me despite all that I've provided for him. Am I the bad guy for considering divorcing my husband after what my sister-in-law revealed? Before continuing, don't forget to subscribe. New stories every day. Update 1. I talked with my parents about everything, and, as everyone on Reddit agreed, I need to leave my husband. What he's done is truly unforgivable. He went to such lengths to lie about me over the years, even though I've been nothing but a good and loyal partner. His audacity to lie and claim that I was in debt proves I can't trust him. I'm planning to talk to him and let him know I've decided to divorce him. Update 2. It's been a week since my last update. I spoke with my husband 2 days ago. He'd been calling and texting me nonstop. He even contacted my parents, who told him I was staying with them, but that was all they said. He came to my parents' house yesterday so we could talk. He was clearly shocked and started apologizing right away. I asked him if he even knew why he was apologizing, and he nodded, telling me that after I left, he called everyone, and his sister told him she'd had a conversation with me, so that's when he found out. I asked him why he'd tell such awful lies about me and how insulted I felt when his sister called me and said he was trapping himself with a baby. He nodded remorsefully and went on to say that he'd always felt insecure around his family members. He told me that all his parents cared about was their wealth and status, so he was too ashamed to tell them the truth about anything. He continued, saying that when his family asked where his car was, it was easier to blame me and tell them a story about how I was in debt and that he was helping me out instead of owning up to his mistakes. I shook my head in disappointment and told him I had no idea he could be so manipulative and deceitful. I reminded him of how hard I'd worked all these years to keep us afloat, and here he was shamelessly admitting how easily he'd betrayed me. I told him I was divorcing him. When he heard that, he started begging me not to do it, saying we should think about the baby, but I told him that we don't have to be married to co-parent our child. I pointed out that our child would be much happier growing up in a stable environment, free of all this tension and conflict in our relationship. Despite his pleading, I stood firm on my decision to end the marriage. Clearly, we had reached a point where staying together wasn't healthy for either of us. The thought of subjecting my child to a broken home full of fighting and resentment wasn't something I was willing to accept. He pleaded a bit more, but in the end, he had to leave when he saw I wasn't changing my mind. He even tried to apologize to my parents before leaving, but they looked at him with disappointment and didn't respond to his apology. Update 3. Many of you suggested I reach out to his family and set the record straight. I don't want to see them again, but I do feel it's right to finally tell them the truth once and for all. So, yesterday I sat down and wrote a long email to his parents and his sister, detailing every expense I had paid for Ron, complete with screenshots of payments from my bank account. I explained how he was the one with the debts and mounting bills, all while continuing to buy one luxury item after another. I made it clear that I wanted nothing to do with them, and that Ron was free to distance himself from my child if that was what he desired, but he'd still be obligated to pay child support each month. I informed them of my decision to divorce Ron and told them how they could finally have their way by marrying him off to a much wealthier woman. Since my email, Ron has been sending me furious messages, as his parents and his sister are now livid with him for lying about me. They've even called me, but I haven't bothered to answer. His sister sent me a message apologizing for what she said and begging me not to cut ties with the family. Honestly, I couldn't care less about their apologies or opinions at this point. I've already decided to move on with the divorce, so I'll be meeting with a divorce attorney next week. As for my pregnancy, I'm determined to provide a stable and loving environment for my baby, even if that means raising my child separately from Ron. I have my family's support, and I'm confident I can face the challenges ahead as a single mother. Update 4. After discussing things with my lawyer and reflecting on the situation, I've decided to take further legal action against my ex-husband, Ron. Since he blatantly lied about me to his family, making them believe I was responsible for his debts, I've decided to sue him for the money I contributed to help pay off his debt during our marriage. My lawyer is currently preparing the necessary legal documents to start the lawsuit. I'm determined to recover every penny I invested in his so-called debt, because he took advantage of my generosity and lied about my financial situation to his family. I know this extra step might cause even more tension, but I feel it's necessary to do justice and protect my own financial interests. His family's reaction has been, as expected, negative. They're furious about my decision to divorce and now about the lawsuit I'm filing. They've expressed their outrage and have been pressuring me to drop the case. However, I'm committed to moving forward with the legal process to ensure that justice is served. Update 5. Good news. After a long legal battle, I finally won the lawsuit against my ex-husband, Ron. The court determined that he was responsible for the debt he had accumulated and that lying about my financial situation was completely unjust. As a result, it is Ron's family who will be paying back all the money I contributed during our marriage. This includes not only the ongoing bills and expenses but also every other financial contribution I made to support him. The reaction from Ron's family to this decision has been hard to handle. They're furious and have expressed their outrage at having to pay for the debt Ron accumulated. In addition to winning the lawsuit, I also obtained a divorce from Ron. The court ruled that our marriage was over and granted the divorce without issue. As part of the divorce settlement, Ron was ordered to pay child support for our future child. This measure will ensure that my child has the necessary financial support while growing up. That's all from me. I'm going to focus on having my baby and raising them, as I'm already more than busy with work and everything else.